All right, so we're on. So, Dad, for this political science project, I want to talk about your lobbying experience. And the first thing I want to know is sort of like what you went to DC to go talk about lobbying for.
So throughout my career, I've had the opportunity to advocate for public policy that is right for our fellow citizens and to level the playing field to make sure that our economy also works appropriately. And so I've had many opportunities to talk to state and local legislators as well as congressional members of the Congressional Commission, the Federal Reserve, and the Department of Justice. And each one of those cases, I've been there to present an issue to help get support to rectify some situations that were not in the public interest.
Okay. Can you talk about the parties that the people that you talked to again? You cut out for just a second there. So the Department of Justice.
Sure. So in the district, I've been to talk to the Financial Services Committee, both in the House of Representatives and in the Senate, the Senate Banking Committee, the Federal Trade Commission, the Department of Justice, and the Federal Reserve.
Yeah. Okay, cool. And you went to talk about what specifically?
So I was involved in a former company in the network business, how credit and debit cards, specifically debit cards, work. And it's a pretty esoteric part of the economy, but with significant impact for fellow citizens. So I think, as you're aware, debit cards are now the significant majority of how consumers make payments at the point of sale. Many more debit transactions than credit transactions. You know the history. People used to pay with cash, then they would pay with checks, and then ultimately they have started paying with credit cards, and now the significant majority of those transactions are being done with debit cards instead. And there are many debit networks that compete to get that transaction at the point of sale. All the major brands that you're aware of and some lesser brands. And there was significant concern that the structure of the market and the way that the largest players were competing was anti-competitive, and as a result was leading to higher fees for merchants, which ultimately are being passed on to consumers. So in each of those conversations, I was talking about the outsized market influence a few players could have on the industry landscape in total, specifically leading to higher prices for merchants, which in turn led to higher prices for consumers. Okay. And I wanted to address that and make legislators and regulators aware of that opportunity for improvement.
And how did you get the opportunity to go talk to all these people? Hey, you still there? Can you hear me? Barry?
Wondering if maybe.
Hey, Barry, can you hear me?
Hey, your picture, Will, I can't see you.
Okay, I'm connecting to my phone's hotspot to see if that'll work a little bit better. Can you see me now?
No. Yes.
Awesome. So how'd you get the opportunity to go see all of these people?
When I was at my last assignment, previous to my current assignment, I had developed a certain amount of expertise in the industry, having run one of those competing debit networks and also running a big payments business that was processing $3 or $4 trillion a year of volume. So I had some perspective that I think regulators and the House and Senate committees were interested in learning about.
So they called you up.
So as a combination, I had been, expressing concern for some time with through multiple channels that I thought that this was an area that required some additional oversight and review, and did that through multiple connections we had as an organization with people in authority in the government over an extended period of time, and ultimately turned into an invitation to come and talk.
That's cool. And did your conversations have a real effect on how legislation was put into place, or judges ruled on cases?
I think it did. Actually, I'm very confident it did. One of the things that from an earlier standpoint had come to pass in the financial industry in 2008, after the terrible financial crash, there were a number of reforms that went into place. And part of that was an amendment that was called the Durbin Amendment that regulated the fees for debit card transactions. And it made the point of competition, it made a point of creating price competition for debit transactions. And, that was one of so as part of supporting that originally in 2008, and then again later, as the implementation of that was not going quite as intended, raising that and having those conversations about the implementation and how it wasn't working quite as intended.
Yeah. So this was not actually lobbying. This was you got invited by these people to go talk to them and give you expertise on the industry.
Well, be clear, I had a point of view, and I was advocating for change, which is in effect lobbying.
Yeah.
And we had a series of lobbyists, some on staff, licensed lobbyists. We had additional lobbyists that we had hired to help make the connections and start carrying our message forward. And ultimately that led to the multiple sessions and meetings that I had.
So tell me about how you made those connections through lobbyists.
So lobbyists, the way lobbyists work is that they are perpetually working with Congress people, regulators, and other people of influence, building a relationship. It's all a relationship game. And they're building those relationships in advance of advocating for a specific cause. And so those lobbyists build relationships, and then when they have a client, like me in this case, they already know the people on the Financial Services Committee in the Senate and the House. They know the key regulators in the FTC, OTC, not OTC, I'm sorry, OCC, Office of the Comptroller of Currency, the Federal Reserve, et cetera. And so when you have a client with an issue like we had that we wanted to raise, they knew who the people were and could make appropriate introductions. Now, in those circumstances, just because a lobbyist has a relationship with a regulator doesn't mean the regulator or the congressperson or the senator will take the meeting. There has to be something of mutual interest. So lobbying only works when you have something that you want to discuss with a person with authority, and they have a mutual interest. And that mutual interest usually has to revolve around the common good of the public interest, et cetera. If you simply want to go and say, you should give me a specific tax break, or you should do something that specifically advantages me at the expense of the common good, there's no point, because you're not going to have a meeting. So the point about lobbying only is that you need to make the case that what you're advocating for matches with the public interest, and that you've got something of benefit that the person of in authority can take a step forward on and have something positive to bring to for the public good.
So, so the process is that you hired a lobbyist who had a connection with some powerful people in government, and then they made introductions to you, and then, or at least people in the company, and then those same people that you made connections with asked for you to come talk to them in order to understand the industry so that they could better make laws.
And then the meeting only gets arranged once those people of influence agree there's something to discuss. And then the meeting gets set up. Again, a lobbyist that is simply trying to advocate for public policy that benefits you alone, but is not in the common interest, those meetings don't happen. And so I think that often, in the popular media, it's that the messages are that, lobbyists are terrible and that they're influence peddlers, and it's the influence of big money or corporations trying to influence government. And the truth is that surely large organizations and those that can afford to lobby do get their voices heard. But be very clear that lobbying only has impact if there is mutual interest. And if there is, meaning that there has to be something in it for the common good. So when you hear people in media saying lobbyists and the money and special interests are all terrible, I'll remind everybody that everything is a special interest, because something that's important to you and your constituents, I may think is a special interest and doesn't warrant attention. But my interests are my interests, and you may think they're special interests, but they're important to me, so I represent them. And in a functioning democracy, every voice has a right to be heard. People get upset because decisions don't always go their way, and they're looking for a scapegoat. And the scapegoat is always to blame somebody else. It's always someone else's fault. Well, the truth is, sometimes legislation gets passed that isn't perfect, that does favor one party or another. But on average, the system works because people's voices get heard.
Yeah, one of the things we recognized in the class was that lobbying is important, and without lobbying, it would be harder to understand special interests. And it seems and feels dirty because there's money involved and politicians and campaign donations. But that sort of without those meetings, it would be harder for politicians to understand the needs of their constituents, especially from an industry level standpoint.
I completely agree with that. And so, in the case that we were talking about, and I've had many different conversations, but you've been specifically asking about this one around debit networks. To the untrained observer, those people that are making noise, that are spouting that special interest, I would generally say I would say they are ignorant of the facts in most cases. So someone may have looked at my communication through lobbyists to Congress and all of these regulatory agencies as we were a special interest. Well, the true facts are, what we were there to talk about was that legislation that was passed was not working appropriately, that was leading to higher fees for merchants, that were ultimately leading to higher fees for consumers. And yes, the networks and all those in the payments industry had a dog in the fight, so to speak. But at the end, it was about protecting end consumers and protecting them from unnecessary expense. And so, a typical media reporter would miss the truth because there's a level of sophistication that requires deeper understanding than simply is going to fit in a soundbite that goes across a headline. But if you dig into what I was there to talk with, people of influence about, was really about ultimately protecting consumers and keeping prices low. But it takes a high degree of sophistication to understand the intricacies of how those pieces come together to affect the outcome. And again, the uneducated person that's going to say, well, there they go again, big companies trying to get their way. Big companies for sure, big companies that have a real, true point of view that are ultimately going to create better and more competition.
Yeah. One of the things you said was that you had to talk with the Department of Justice. And I thought that the Department of Justice was not necessarily involved in lobbying because justices should not necessarily be pulled according to political ideas. In what way did you get to talk to people at the Department of Justice?
Yeah, and so to be clear, you're right. You don't lobby at the Department of Justice, but the Department of Justice has responsibility for enforcing and managing legislation and making sure that legislation is implemented the way it's supposed to be, or at least legally. And so the DOJ was interested in discussing with me and others, not just me, but others, sort of the impact of what's happening in the marketplace. Again, some of this gets really esoteric and fine points. And without being able to understand all of those intricacies, something on the surface may seem very innocuous or not important or without impact. But only when you're able to go deep and understand the intricacies of a situation can you have a better shot at managing and regulating or litigating, in the case of DOJ, legislation and the impact of behavior relative to legislation. And so, it was educational for the DOJ to understand sort of more perspective on what's happening in the broader marketplace.
So did the
So
DOJ?
to be clear, I was not asking them to do anything. That was not my place. I was there purely as sort of think about it as a witness, if you will, to help them become educated on the intricacies of a marketplace.
So did you testify in court, or did you just take a meeting with judges?
So I was not under oath, and so it was not in a court. It was purely an educational session to explain to them, the intricacies of market competitiveness and the impact of what seemed like minor rules that really weren't minor impacts at all.
And who specifically are you talking to? Were you talking to judges or like district attorneys?
No, investigators. So the way the DOJ is arranged is they certainly have litigators, and almost everyone there is an attorney, but they also have people, think about them as investigators that are fact finders, that are collecting insight. And for sure, to be clear, they weren't just talking to me, they were talking to other people with a similar point of view. And of course, they were talking to people with very different points of view as well, because they were trying to collect a full picture of what was happening. And I have great respect for how the DOJ went about all this. It was not one-sided at all. It was absolutely understanding the entirety of a situation.
And the way that you're able to be called into the room is because you had connections to lobbyists and other important figures. And through those connections, they invited you because you had industry experience?
Yeah, and so, if you think about it, I mean, how would you know, well, who would you call if you were trying to understand the competitive nature of a market? If you don't know the market, you got to find experts, right? So you send messages out saying, I'm looking for expertise on a particular topic. And in this case, if you have lobbyists and other people that are networked in the broader community, one of those people gets a call and says, hey, we're looking for expertise on this. Do you know anybody? And that turns into a relationship and an opportunity for influence.
So for some of those initial meetings that lobbyists set up with people with influence in the House or just in Congress in general, what are those meetings like?
You know what, Will? Can we record this again in a few minutes? I got a call right now.
Yes.